Welcome to 5 Shades of Gherkin. Hello, I'm Ken Pugh. What are the objectives and tests for this session? Well, to appreciate the different shades of Gherkin, to understand when each shade might be appropriate, and to revise scenarios to make them more readable and maintainable. So here's the outline. First, we'll start with an introduction. We'll show a few shades and then do a try it out so you can experiment on your own. Then a few more shades, followed by a try it out, and then a wrap up. So let's start with the introduction. I'm Ken Pugh. I've been doing programming and process for a long time. In fact, over 2/5 of a century of software development. I'm the co-author of the Safe Agile Software Engineering Workshop. My focus these days is on immersive team-based training in behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development. I've got a few books out, including Lean Agile Acceptance Test-Driven Development, Better Software Through Collaboration, Pre-Factoring, which is about extreme abstraction, extreme separation, and extreme readability, and finally, Interface-Oriented Design, which is about designing interfaces both programmatically and for things like microservices. Here's my overall rule. There are exceptions to every statement except this one. What do I mean by that? When I say always, I don't mean always, but usually always. And when I say never do something, I don't mean never ever, but usually never. So, if you feel that there's an exception to something I've said, feel free to raise that exception. Send me an email and we can discuss it. Next is perspective. Someone looks at something and they go, I see there's some yellows and some reds there and a few oranges. And they turn to somebody else and that second person says, I see the orange, but don't you see the greens and the blues? Well, you turn to a third person and you go, well, the third person says, I see the green, I see the yellows, I don't see a blue. And you start to have, I'll call it a discussion about what is the underlying reality. And if you pause for a moment and take all 3 viewpoints, you will arrive at a consensus on what is the underlying truth. So how does this apply in ATDD, BDD? We have 3 perspectives, the triad. The customer's perspective, who understands what they want, the developer, who is in charge of implementing that, and the tester, who looks for those odd cases. So let's just give a little background on the example I'll be using. This is Sam's vinyl album rental store. They rent vinyl albums to customers. Turns out that this is like the old VHS tapes. But if you know today, vinyl albums cost $60, $80 sometimes. And so Sam is making a business out of renting the vinyl. And we have a simple story. As a clerk, I want to check out an album for a customer and print a rental contract. There are 3 perspectives on this story. The scenario, a text-based perspective, a context diagram, and a workflow. So let's look first at the scenario. Here's a flow scenario, the template for it. Given some state, i.e. that we need to do a setup, we have some preconditions. When an action or event occurs, a trigger, then a new state or an output occurs with an assert, or that's the post conditions. A flow, given, when, then. And here's the outline shade for this normal checkout. Given customer has an ID and the album has an ID, when the album is not currently rented, well, when they check it out, then the album's recorded as rented and a rental contract is printed. That's an outline of the flow. Given the state, when the action occurs, then this is the results. Well, there's our given, our when, and our then. Let's take a look at a different perspective. The context perspective. In the context perspective, as you'll notice, here we have a user that sends commands into the system and they get some views back out of the system. We also have a shared database where the process stores some information and retrieves that information when necessary. Then we may send some output to other systems or receive events back from other systems. A context diagram shows what's going on in the external view of the system. Well, the retrievals are usually part of the given. We already have that information on a database. The when is either the user sending a command in or an event that's occurring from another system. And the then part is either storage back on the shared database, sending a view back to our user, or sending some output to another system. And a scenario could have one or more of those thens. Let's take Sam's context. Here we have a clerk that is going to check out an album. We have an enterprise database where we're going to retrieve the album and the customer information and record our rental. And then we're going to print a contract onto our printer. So given we have an album and a customer, when the clerk checks out that album, then we print the rental contract and we're going to record that the album is rented. That's the second way of looking at this scenario. Here's a third way. Here's a flow, a workflow, register and rent scenario. We register as a customer, we check out an album, we check it back in, and eventually we'll deregister. And we might have some loops and loops within this overall flow. But we can take one of these steps in this flow and break it into smaller pieces, such as here's the checkout, we record the rental, we print the contract, and we get the payment for the rental. Now we've got a given, when, and a then for the step, and then we might have multiple sets of given for the checkout itself. Given that we have those customers registered, when we check out, then we'll record the rental and print the contract. And that get payment is going to be another scenario. So let's look at a few shades of Gherkin. And we have different shades for different phases. Some people go through a phase in BDD. They start with discovery, i.e., an open sort of process to figure out what are all the potential scenarios or conditions that a story is going to take. And then they do formulation to get these into very specific examples. And finally, they automate those examples. Although these are the three phases, there's some loop backs. Sometimes when you're formulating your scenarios, you just realize that there are additional conditions that need to be met. Now, just revisiting that scenario template, given some state, that's how we set up some preconditions. When an action or event occurs, that's our trigger. Then a new state or an output occurs, and assert are our post conditions. And notice this is stateful. We're going to set up some state in the given, which may change in the then. Now we've got three shades of this flow. We've got the outline, the data, and the tables. So first is our outline shade. We saw this before. Given an album and a customer, and it's not rented, when we check it out, then record it as rented and print the rental contract. Sort of an overview of the flow. A given, when, and a then, as we've seen. But we can add some data or values to this shade. Now we have given a customer with an ID 07 and named James, and an album with an ID 82 and a title Beatles Greatest Hits and not rented. When we check it out to customer 007, then 82 is recorded as rented to that customer, and we produce a rental contract with a customer ID 007 named James, album ID 82, and the title Beatles Greatest Hits. We're putting values in and making this in to an example that most people can, or all the perspectives in the triad should be able to understand. You can have on the shade maybe a few less words if everybody's familiar with the domain. That's the value shade. Let's look at the table shade. We're going to take that information and using step-def tables, we're going to put it into a more specific form. There's our ID of James with 007 and our A2 Beatles Greatest Hits not rented. When we check out occurs, A2 is going to be checked out to 007. Now our album is going to be rented to 007 and we'll print a rental contract out. So that's a third shade. We've got our outline, our data or value shade, and our table shade. So now try it out. Pause this video and see if you can write either an outline of values or a table shade of a scenario for, as a sender, I want to send tweets that appear in my followers' preferred language. And you can start with just one follower. Well, here are some possible scenarios you might come up with. The outline: given a sender speaks one language and the receiver speaks another, when the sender tweets a message, then the receiver sends the message, sees the message in their own language. Here's the value. Given the sender speaks American English and the receiver speaks British English, when the sender tweets behavior-driven development, then the receiver sees behavior-driven development. And the third shade, the table shade. Given our registered users are Joe, who speaks American English and he's a followed person, and Sam, who speaks British English, who's a follower, when the tweet is sent by Joe, a tweet of behavior-driven development, then the tweet is received by Sam and it's behavior-driven development. 3 ways to indicate that flow. And here's a chatty shade. The original on our album was simply when album E2 is checked out to customer 007. You might see a chatty win that looks like this. When the clerk accesses the checkout page and enters A2 into the album field and 007 into the customer field and clicks the rent button. Well, that's where the scenario is almost scripting every single piece of the UI interaction. Now, there may be instances in which you want to have something chatty, but normally in scenarios, we're simply going to talk about what information that we're putting into the system, not how it got there. Because this sort of scenario can break if you start to alter the UI. So let's look at a few more shades. The template for a business rule or calculation. Well, first, that flow scenario, which we just did, has an action or event that occurs, and that makes it stateful. We need to have a setup that we're going to apply the action or event to. But on a business rule or calculation scenario, we basically have, here's some inputs, and we get an output. And these are stateless. So the template looks like, given some outputs, when we perform a calculation, then this is the output. Let's take an example of this. Here is a customer rating is good and order total is less than or equal to $10. we're going to give a discount, otherwise a 1% discount. If the customer rating is excellent, we'll give a discount of 1% for any order, and if it's greater than 50, then 5% discount. A sample business rule. So let's make up scenarios that are examples of this business rule. And we're going to start with a separate scenario shade. Here's the scenario. Given the total is $10 and rating is good, when the discount is computed, then the percent is 0%. And we create another scenario for each of the possibilities. $10.01, rating is good. When a discount is computed, percent is 1%. And scenario, given the total is $0.01 and rating is excellent, when the discount is computed, percent is 1. And we do this for all the remaining possibilities. Now this is a lot of duplication. So we have the scenario outline shade. And the scenario outline shade basically repeats this scenario for as many times as there are lines in the example table and replaces each of the values in the brackets with the values in the example table. So now we have the 5 scenarios that we're going to run through in the scenario outline shade. This is going to save a lot of writing over the separate scenarios, making it in fact a shorter feature file. But we can even make this simpler. This is the one-step scenario shade for business rules. We're going to compute the discount percentage. It's going to be based on order total and customer rating. And notice here we have exactly the same table, but it's only a single step. Internally, the code will take those 2 values, compute the discount, and compare it to that. If you have a lot of business rules, having the one-step scenario can shorten all of your feature files. And incidentally, may speed them up a little bit. So the question now is, how many examples do we need? Some, just enough for understanding, complete all the standard test checks, or combinations for extensive testing. Well, we saw the sum. Let's see what complete means. Complete, well, we might add some lines that test whether the parameters are actually being used. For example, here is $50.01. Excellent should be 5, but let's just make sure that good at $50.01 remains at 1. So we're doing all the breakpoints and simply parameter value variation. But we could add all the combinations. The tester might want to do this just to see if there's any hidden defects. So they go for 0.01 good, that's 0, minus 10.01. It should be 0 good. Well, maybe minus $10.01 should not be a valid order total. Time for the triad to meet back and discuss the new combination. You can also do a combination with the include. Instead of listing all the values in a table like that, you simply can do an include with values.csv, a commented limited file. And there's a Gherkin preprocessor that you can find on GitHub that basically will read that CSV file and convert it to a table format. Now a tester can go off, work on a spreadsheet, finding all the potential combinations, include them here, but your feature file will remain short since it's only making a reference to all those values. For all of our business rules, they're going to be used somewhere in a flow scenario. And so you typically show one variation in a flow scenario. For example, customer discount is applied to an order. We'll pick one of those lines in the business rule, find a customer who's good. That's a stateful. We need to have a customer established that's good. Make up an order for $10.01, and the order should get a 10-cent discount, our 1% discount. So we've got business rule scenarios and flow scenarios that utilize business rules. In addition, we have domain term scenarios that denote valid values for the domain terms. And the template is simply for domain term, given a value, when we check it, then the value is either valid or invalid. Well, let's take the scenario outline shade for domain term. That discount percentage, should it be negative? Is there a maximum? So here we have the scenario discount percentage. Given the percentage is a value, when it's validated, then it's valid or not valid. 0 is yes, 99 is yes, but 100 is too high, and -1 is too low. So now we have a way of specifying valid values for domain terms. But we have a second shade that we can apply to this, the single step. We can simply just say percentage must be 0 to 99 and just list them one step def in the implementation. And we could have domain terms that we simply list what the allowed values are, i.e. the equivalent of enumeration. So the customer type is going to be one of good or excellent. Well, so try it out. Write a business rule scenario for translating a tweet. And write a domain term scenario for a tweet, i.e. a tweet is a domain term. Do we have valid and invalid tweets? Pause this video if you want to just try it on your own. Well, welcome back. Here's a possible scenario to translate from one language to another. We have an input, a from, a to, and an output. So the input is behavior, the from is American English, the to is British English, and the output is the British version. That's a business rule. We don't have to have a tweet, an action. We're simply taking a translation and making sure it's correct. And we would try this for multiple languages, as many as we desire, to make sure that our tweets, our translation was working. No state involved. Information comes from the input and goes to the output. And perhaps we've got a tweet in the tweet language. So LOL in American English will become laughing out loud. As many lines and examples as you wish to help both define the behavior, so you can have some, you can try it from multiple languages, and the tester might want to try a variety of combinations. Same scenario format, it's just how many combinations you want to use. And here's a domain term, tweet, the tweet domain term. Here's our tweet hi. Is that valid? Yep, it's correct. Here's hi, and we give it like an excessive number of characters, and it would not be valid because it's too long. And a tweet that doesn't contain anything is not valid because there isn't any message. And how? Perhaps you also would have this for what are the particular characters that might be allowed in a tweet if you wanted to do that. So this is not an ending, but a beginning. What were our objectives? Well, given these were the objectives, appreciate the different shades of Gherkin, understanding with each shade might be appropriate, and revise scenarios to make them more readable and maintainable. When we've now completed this session, then were these objectives achieved? If not, write me an email and maybe we'll change this around and add your customer test for this session. So if you need to contact me about immersive team-based training and behavior-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, or just questions on BDD, ATDD in general, you can write me at ken@kenpugh.com. Go to LinkedIn, connect up with me at Ken Pugh, or visit my website, kenpugh.com. Thanks very much, and take care.